No, la pregunta es muy directa, ¿no? Yo creo que es con todo el riesgo que hay ahora mismo, ¿no? Con el auge de la extrema derecha en distintas partes de Europa. En España el caso es un poco peculiar porque están más bien circunscritos a Cataluña, el partido Plataforma per Cataluña de Anglada y todas estas cosas. ¿Cómo ves cómo puede evolucionar el euroescepticismo, ¿no? Que parece ser que puede adoptar muchas formas, desde la extrema derecha pero también desde la extrema izquierda? El euroescepticismo sí que es algo bastante, de alguna manera, clásico en el Reino Unido. Es algo relativamente nuevo, sobre todo también que aparezcan las encuestas aquí en el Estado español. ¿Eso es una tendencia que puede que se popularice o se extienda más por toda Europa y que, sobre todo, qué signo puede tener, ¿no? Si hacia la derecha o hacia la izquierda? Gracias.
So, for a long time, criticisms of the European Union and its existing forms are left to the xenophobic, anti-immigrant right, who want to turn people within each nation against each other and also turn this against people in country against country. Now, in Britain, that's the case and has been the case for a long time, and it's been the case here as well. And the point I'd make is there's a difference between criticising for xenophobic and nationalist reasons and wanting to get out of the European Union, which I don't support, and to say that the EU needs to be changed, that it needs to be democratised, and that the neoliberal elements that are embedded in the European Union and its treaties need to be taken away, that we need to instead, if you like, build a social Europe, a Europe running the interests of working people rather than one of corporate interests. I mean, at the moment there's a free trade agreement being debated with the United States. That will give huge powers to corporations and also open public services even further to the private sector. Well, that's completely unacceptable, and that has to be opposed. But that needs unity across Europe to do that. So the point is this, my critique of the European Union isn't to say I want to break it up. I don't advocate withdrawal. And it's not nationalist or xenophobic. It's the opposite. It's internationalist. It's about building unity across Europe to change the European Union, to make it run in the interests of working people. That's what I support. And I think that's a project that needs support across Europe. But what the likes of UKIP and the populist right are doing, as I say, is turning anger, justifiable anger, at the fact people are getting poorer. People are under attack. Their rights are under attack. Turning that anger away from those at the top to people's neighbours. And that's what I wrote. I mean, I wrote this open letter to UKIP supporters. And instead of just saying, you're a bunch of racists or xenophobes, I said, look, who's really responsible for the mess this country's in? Is it the Indian nurse? Is it the Polish fruit picker? Or is it the bankers who plunged this country into economic disaster? The tax avoiders, the poverty-paying bosses, the private landlords, the legal loan sharks who charge extortionate rates on loans? They're the ones who are really responsible. So let's take on that xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, and let's build a Europe in the interests of its people. That's what we need to do.
Hola, muchas gracias por tu discurso. Creo, sobre todo, que tiene especial valor el modo en que denuncias cómo las clases medias se convierten, en cierto modo, en un instrumento de las élites para generar odio y resentimiento hacia las clases trabajadoras. Mi pregunta es si esa utilización de las clases medias no es una novedad específica de la era neoliberal, sino una constante histórica en todo el siglo XX que ya funcionaba en la época más álgida del estado de bienestar. ¿En qué sentido quiero decir esto? De algún modo, en la época de esplendor del estado de bienestar, lo que ocurre es que a través de una corresponsabilización por los riesgos sociales de todas las clases distintas de la sociedad, una corresponsabilización por igual, se oculta una injusticia y una desigualdad estructural. Es decir, las clases medias se conforman con una idea compensatoria o reparatoria de la justicia que neutraliza el antagonismo social, el antagonismo de los de arriba contra los de abajo, y renuncian, por tanto, a la demanda de una justicia estructural. En ese sentido, respecto a tu discurso, quería preguntarte si no es peligroso ceder a un punto de nostalgia hacia un periodo de esplendor de los sindicatos, de esplendor del Estado social, y si no habría que buscar una fórmula distinta y no meramente un retorno a esa época dorada. Gracias.
Well, firstly, I don't propose going back to where we were. I mean, I'll give you an example. The form of nationalisation that existed was very undemocratic. It was top-down and bureaucratic, which is why instead I'd propose workers' and consumers' ownership of services and industries, for example. I think that's a very different and better model to the statist top-down formula. In Britain, the point I make about the welfare state is, well, actually, what it's become is a subsidy for bosses, employers, and landlords, because what it does is it tops up, it subsidises poverty wages, meaning that bosses pay low wages and then the state tops them up. Landlords charge extortionate rents, and then those rents are subsidised by the state as well. Well, instead, I'd support having a living wage, which we've never had. That's not going back anywhere. That's a new concept. A living wage that everyone can live on instead of depending on the state. And that, at the same time, we should have people's housing needs met. So instead of subsidising private landlords, we have people's basic housing needs met. So I don't think that is nostalgia. I think it's about adapting to a very complex and new world we live in. I mean, the point you make about the middle class is this. I don't really care if people call themselves working class or middle class. And we could talk about working people, if you like. I mean, what neoliberalism does do is it's the dogma, if you like, or the way aspiration is spoken about means you, the individual, you get on in life by yourself, you through your own efforts, and you become middle class. That's what everyone should aspire to. If you fail to do that, then that's your fault. You're to blame, and there should be no support for you, or as little support as possible, because why should society pay for your irresponsibility? And the point I'd make is that whether you call yourself working class or middle class, what I'm interested in is uniting people on the basis of shared common interests. Whether you're a bin collector, whether you're working in a supermarket, whether you're in a call centre, a telephone operator, whether you're a teacher or a nurse, you've all got the same interests. You all need, or an unemployed young person, you all want secure jobs. You all want to be paid properly. You all want good conditions and rights in the workplace, not to be treated as a piece of meat to be hired and fired at the whim of the bosses. You all want good public services. You all want bosses to pay their taxes properly. These are all things that unite people. It's a shared common interest. And that's what I'm looking to do, to put aside people's actual or perceived differences, whether they're middle class or working class or however they see themselves, to turn people's anger away from each other, away from your neighbour, the immigrant, the unemployed person, the public sector worker, and to turn that anger at those at the top. And that means having a common shared interest. And that means building a new and better world, not going back to the past, but building a new society which is based on meeting people's needs, which isn't top-down and bureaucratic, but is about extending democracy, not just in politics, but in the workplace and the economy as well. And I think that is a common ambition to have. And that's one, as I say, that can't be won just in one country or the other. We've all got to link together, otherwise we will all fail.
Hola. Yo he echado de menos en tu análisis un elemento que me parece fundamental desde hace... ¿Me escuchas?
Sí.
Ok. ¿Sí?
¿Nos puedes traer otro aparato porque sé que pierde la conexión? Ah, el mío, claro. Ah, ¿dónde? Gracias. Esto sí parece que sí tiene. 1 y 2.
Ok, ¿ahora qué tal?
I think so.
Comentaba que...
Que lo pongas encima de la... de table.
Yeah, that's better.
Vale, va a la tercera. Comentaba que hecho de falta del análisis, tanto de la trayectoria histórica de los últimos 30 o 40 años, como a futuro, un elemento que para mí es fundamental, que es el de la revolución tecnológica en curso. Esta mañana he ido a comprar a un supermercado, había 6 cajas y me han indicado que, bueno, que tenía que ir a un aparato en el cual pues, meto las monedas y la máquina lo hace por sí sola. Lo relaciono completamente con el análisis de la clase trabajadora que haces en tu libro. Los puestos de trabajo que ocupa fundamentalmente la clase trabajadora, dependiente, guardia de seguridad, pero puestos de trabajo como los que acabas de citar tú en la última respuesta, como profesor, por ejemplo, pues se pueden ir al garete de aquí a muy poco tiempo. Lo dicen análisis muy apocalípticos, aparece en The Economist hace un mes y medio. ¿De qué forma se puede dar respuesta a esto, teniendo en cuenta el fetiche de la tecnología absoluto que hay, no solo ahí fuera, sino seguramente aquí entre todos nosotros, donde bueno, pues, la gente está tuiteando y con el Facebook y todas estas historias? ¿Y de qué forma ponernos de acuerdo, como tú proponías, puede servir para corregir una tendencia tan de fondo y tan poderosa? Gracias.
I think that's a very important and interesting point. I think the point you make is that there is, with particularly many unskilled jobs, a threat from technological development in theory, which could strip away huge numbers of jobs. Now, in Britain, as industry collapsed, it was replaced in many cases by the service sector. Now, supermarkets and shops in Britain are the second biggest employer. Now, they've exploded in size, actually, in the last 3 decades. They've trebled in size, the number of people employed there. But with self-service machines and so on you talk about, the potential is for those jobs to disappear. Now, a few points I'd make is, firstly, we need an industrial strategy where the state intervenes. Instead of saying, you let the market decide, the state doesn't pick winners or losers, where the state intervenes to create a new generation of skilled jobs you can't just disappear or shut down or replace. Now, what they did in Germany, for example, is with an industrial strategy and an active state, they created huge numbers of jobs in high-tech industries and then in renewable energy industries. So they kept modernizing and adapting to new conditions. And I think that has to happen in all Western and other countries where you keep modernizing, and it's not a case of technology there being such a threat, because these are high-skilled jobs and, you know, research and development intensive and so on. And they're supported by apprenticeships, which give young people, you know, a secure route into a well-paid job and so on. I think with technological development, in theory, you know, to have a society where we can all work less but support ourselves is a good thing. I mean, I think often people work too much. You know, I think having more time for leisure activity and to spend with your family and your friends, and progressive thinkers used to think that technological development would help free us from having to work so much. But as long as people, of course, are paid properly and are able to support themselves, if we just have an economy where, you know, we got rid of industry, it's replaced by low-skilled jobs, which then get destroyed by technology, then there is no future for millions of people. And obviously that's not sustainable. So I'd say let's use technological development to create new jobs, to free us from having to work so much as long as we're all paid properly. But we have to, I think about this soon, because what you're talking about is something which is accelerating, and we're seeing it in retail, in shops and supermarkets and elsewhere. And in a country like this, where, over half of young people are already unemployed, to take away even more jobs and leave this as a permanent feature of the economy, well, that's not obviously a sustainable or acceptable position to be in.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, en primer lugar, quería darle las gracias por el libro, por Chavs. Yo trabajo en servicios sociales y estaba bastante dolido siempre de ver cómo los chicos y chicas con los que trabajo eran motivos de escarnio público, eran la diversión incluso de sus propios vecinos y vecinas, ¿no? Y no escuchaba muchas voces en defensa suya, ¿no? Por eso me dio mucha alegría poder leer el libro. También me molestaba bastante que la propia izquierda se estaba volviendo muy elitista. Antiguamente la izquierda estaba pegada al pueblo y la derecha estaba en la ópera. Y ahora es la izquierda la que si ves un partido de fútbol te pone a parir. Entonces, como que, claro, se ha generado una distancia entre la gente más pobre y la propia izquierda. La entiendo porque es un territorio muy complicado para trabajar, porque los chicos y chicas y la gente con la que yo trabajo en barrios pobres de Madrid no son pobres como Robin Hood. Son racistas, son xenófobos, son a veces egoístas. Es un territorio que está desarticulado socialmente, han sufrido muchísimo, se están llevando una paliza muy gorda y es muy difícil ir ahí a hablar de derechos colectivos o de crisis o de política. Están muy alejados de la política, pero porque también la política está muy alejada de esta gente. Y claro, cuando algo sí sabemos ya, y es que cuando la izquierda no interviene en estos vacíos sociales, lo hace la derecha, siempre ha sido así. Y se está demostrando con el ascenso de la extrema derecha en toda Europa. Entonces, yo quería preguntar si en la experiencia que cuentas en el libro, después de todos los planes de ajuste y privatizaciones de Margaret Thatcher y así, ¿hay alguna experiencia en Inglaterra en la que la izquierda haya apostado por intervenir en esos territorios sociales? Muchas gracias.
Well, it's a really good point. I'm glad you've made that point, because there is a danger of certain sections of the left being very elitist, of effectively writing off the people they should be representing. And if a progressive movement is to be successful, it can't just be dominated by people from relatively affluent backgrounds. It's got to give a platform to voices who are otherwise ignored, who are otherwise airbrushed out of existence or demonized. And that's particularly young people who have no future, who are attacked because of suffering the consequences of the system we all live in and the huge inequalities of wealth and power. And that's why, for me, I always talk in Britain, we talk about working class representation. That means people from working class and from poorer backgrounds being represented in politics, where it's not a bunch of technocrats and people from, who have 3 university degrees each and who have only mixed with people from privileged circumstances, but where you have people who can actually articulate from their own experiences what they've gone through and give a voice to them, whether it be the experience of living in total poverty or of insecure work, of struggling to make ends meet and to feed yourself in very rich countries. And unless those people have a voice, that demonization continues. And it's so important to do that because a US political scientist called George Lakoff, he says this: the right often use stories and the left use facts and statistics, but people connect better with stories. I mean, we're human beings. We're not machines. We connect emotionally with people. So when they have extreme examples of, immigrants living in mansions made out of widescreen television sets with 50 children each, taking money off the state, they put those on the front of the newspaper and it gets people emotionally. They see it. These people exist. See, I can see them on the front of this newspaper. And we've got to do the same. We've got to give a platform to people, like young people you work with, and give them a voice to connect with people so they understand the issues they're going through. And that's what the left has to do. It has to give them that. Now, in Britain, we've got similar problems. And what I try and do, I often, one of the most important things that I do in terms of educating myself and learning, which is a very important process, is I go to schools in inner city areas in Britain, and I talk to the young people there. And I find they are so clever, so savvy, they understand the issues affecting them. They understand that they're going to be poorer than their parents. They can't get an affordable home, that they can't get secure jobs in the future. They know all that. But they have so much anger and fear, as I say, but no hope at all. And those people have to be organised. So I talked to youth community workers after the riots in England in 2011. Some youth community workers in the areas affected by the riots, I spoke to them. The left has to reach out to them, and they find ways of engaging people. They put on football matches where young people can come along, and then at the end of the football match, they have discussions. They bring local politicians and representatives to talk and discuss issues. It's about using social media. You know, so many young people use social media now to actually engage with people and listen to them. And that's the other point, not just talking at them, but listening to them. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to give people a platform. We've got to represent them. And that means going out to these communities. And that's why you're so important, because you work with these people. People on the left should be talking to you. They should be learning from you. And there will not be a successful left or progressive movement unless people like you and the people you work with are listened to properly.
Hola, gracias también por el discurso, por el libro. Yo tenía alguna pregunta sobre el cómo, ¿no? Porque, bueno, intento más despacio. El estado del bienestar de la época dorada que mencionas, ¿no? En parte está construido sobre los restos de la explotación colonial, ¿no? En parte todo lo que estamos perdiendo ahora son lo que los países recuperan dignamente, el gas que antes comprábamos y pagábamos demasiado barato porque pertenecía a otros, ahora ya no lo podemos tener. Y como bien has dicho, mientras que a la izquierda nos cuesta unirnos, en la derecha se siguen organizando constantemente para seguir apropiándose de estos recursos y a menudo mediante la violencia, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué tipo... Cuando hablas de lo que hay que hacer, si te refieres a aún lo que hay que hacer, por así decir, ¿qué tipo de formas de acumular capital sin explotación y sin violencia ves viable? Si piensas que esto a través de las elecciones es posible o si, ¿qué es lo que piensas?
Wow. Okay, that's a big one. Well, I think, I speak of solidarity across Europe. We need to build those links across the world, including the former colonies brutally exploited by Western countries. It's hard and ambitious, of course, but, you know, actually, I spoke to a trade union conference a few months ago where they had African trade unionists, and in fact, I'm speaking at their conference in South Africa in December, Latin American and so on. So there is the prospect for bringing those people together and learning from each other. I mean, one of the things I learned from is Latin America. Now, you know, I talk about, you know, a world of neoliberalism and all the rest of it, but Latin America was one of the great testing grounds for the neoliberal offensive. And those neoliberal ideas were initially imposed by brutal military dictatorships, but even when democracy was restored in those countries, neoliberalism carried on. But now Latin America, unsurprisingly, the first place to suffer neoliberalism is at the vanguard of actually throwing off neoliberalism. And that gives us hope. We should be humble, and we should look to the experiences of Latin America, where there has been a departure from the neoliberal dogma and project, which has had a huge impact on the lives. I mean, I went to Venezuela, and despite the way the media portrays that country, it couldn't be any different from the reality there. And there has been a huge, you know, social revolution in Venezuela, which has transformed people's lives. And also, it's not top-down, it's about political participation. So we should learn from those countries too. But in terms of, you know, I mean, in Britain, it's not just about elections. Democracy isn't just about elections. It's not... You know, you sit there and you go to vote and then you wait 4 years and then you vote again. I mean, it's not how democracy works. It works through protests, civil disobedience, it works through strikes, it works through putting pressure on those above. My quote Frederick Douglass, an African-American statesman, he said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will." And that's how you get social change. You build pressure from below with demands and you force people, you scare them into giving demands and concessions. And in Britain, we've got what I work with is called the People's Assembly. It brings together people in the Green Party, the Labour Party, small left-wing groups, the main trade unions, campaigners for disabled people, elderly people, young people, tax justice. And we don't agree on everything. Good. But instead of arguing with each other, which is what the left tends to do quite well, we know some of you are laughing out of bitterness there, not out of anything else. I mean, has anyone seen The Life of Brian, Monty Python's Life of Brian? Popular Front of Judea, People's Front of Judea, splitters, yeah. Well, we do that very well. We're very good at being angry with each other when we disagree, and less at finding common cause where we do. So we've got to do that. If we can't do that in our respective countries, we're not going to be able to do it internationally. So that's why I said we need common principles, but we need to learn from other countries like Latin America, where they have shaken off neoliberalism, and that gives all of us hope. That's important, hope. It's hot, isn't it? It's very hot in here.
Sí, claro.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Buenas tardes. Me alegro mucho, primero, de que seas joven y me alegro mucho de que en este auditorio haya mucha gente joven. Yo, que no soy tan joven, tengo una preocupación. O sea, en este país ahora mismo estamos sufriendo un acoso y derribo de derechos fundamentales. El derecho de huelga se cuestiona, el derecho de reunión, los movimientos alternativos se demonizan, hay una ley de seguridad ciudadana que recuerda a otros tiempos. Y me pregunta, como persona de izquierda, como educador que soy, es ¿qué izquierda en este país o qué izquierda en Europa es la que tiene que crear ese movimiento que lleve a la esperanza en recuperar un mundo mejor? O sea, en que los pobres de la tierra, los trabajadores, la clase que no tenemos esas posibilidades que tienen otros, seamos capaces de recuperar esa ilusión, y los que nos dedicamos a la enseñanza, seamos capaces de transmitir también esa ilusión y esa esperanza. Yo tengo dudas en qué izquierda o cuál es la izquierda que tiene que hacer esa revolución y ese cambio de ideas. Gracias.
Well, firstly, youth is a state of mind. I think, I mean, you know, that's what all of it, that's what has to be discussed and debated. Because for me, you know, the left is just those broadly who want a society run in the interests of people's needs rather than the profit of a very small number of people. It's about extending democracy everywhere. And that's why what I'm advocating across, because we disagree on lots of things, I'm sure, good. You know, disagreement is the lifeblood of democracy, and that should be the case on the left. It's a positive thing. But what I'm saying is we need, and I don't know why we've not done it in Europe, a key set of common demands we can all rally around. That all of us across Europe, a kind of common charter, a people's charter of demands that all of us can agree on, and then we can struggle and fight for. And, you know, most people don't think, outside of politically minded people don't think in terms of left or right. They think in terms of issues to be addressed in a way that's convincing and coherent, that resonates with their experiences, that's communicated in a language they understand. And that's what a left has to do. And it has to relate to the everyday issues that affect people. I think the left, we're talking about, it can seem quite elitist sometimes. It needs, you know, engaging with people on their everyday needs, like a living wage, like affordable housing, like tax justice, like banks run by the people rather than bailed out and carrying on as they ever did before, like, you know, clamping down on tax avoidance, like public ownership of the utilities, which at the moment, you know, we all suffer from the fact they're run for the interests of profit. And we all agree on those key principles, and then we can all fight for them together. That's the point. And that's the movement we have to have. But we've got to have optimism. I mean, you know, we will build this better world. We're taking the scenic route at the moment, but we will win it. But we have to have hope and optimism. And we've got to look at our ancestors who fought huge odds, not least in a country like this. but we're vindicated by history. And if we do that, we will win. But it needs a bit more courage and determination and a sense of purpose than we've shown so far. But we'll do it.
Gracias. Toco este lado, que es que ha habido muchas preguntas por el otro lado. Bueno, gracias por la charla, ¿no? Antes de nada. Dos cosas. Una, por volver un poco a lo de las colonias que decía la compañera, ¿no? Y decir, por decir una palabra que yo creo que es importante en el debate, que es la palabra globalización, ¿no? Es decir, cuando decimos que es posible unirnos o que se unan mucha gente desfavorecida en todo el mundo, los intereses de todos o construir ese interés común, ¿es eso posible globalmente? Es decir, o los intereses de uno y los beneficios de uno están relacionados con los perjuicios de otro, ¿no? Esa es una pregunta. Y la otra pregunta es en esta cosa que dices, que decías también muy bien, ¿no? De los de derechas piensan individualmente, pero luego se unen, ¿no? Y al revés, lo contrario, que es una frase muy buena, yo creo. ¿Cómo se hace eso? Es decir, ¿nuestras mentes son de derechas o de izquierdas? Me pregunto, los de izquierdas. Y si son de derechas nuestras mentes, ¿las podemos convertir en de izquierdas, de verdad? ¿Cómo se hace eso?
Well, look, in terms of building unity globally, that's not going to happen next week or next year. It's a long process. But for me, it's just a case of, you know, if we're pessimistic about it, it won't happen. But I'm saying it's more possible than ever. Because of social media and means of communication, it is far easier now to build links across the world than it ever was. And because of easier transport and so on. So we've got to use that to our advantage, and we've got to build common links. Because as I say, the struggles are all the same, so we've got to, that's why we have to link them together. And of course it's possible. It's not easy, but you know, they call it a struggle, they don't call it a walkover. I don't think anyone is innately left-wing or right-wing. I think we're all products of our experiences. A lot of people, they feel resigned to the status quo. Injustice becomes like the weather, like the rain. There's nothing you can do about the rain. That's the way the world is. And that's how injustice can feel. That's one of the ways the ruling elite pushes it. This is just the way the world is. And that's what has to be resisted. You have to say, well, actually, you know, if you're going to design a society from scratch, would it be this? Would it be a society where wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite whilst millions of people struggle to look after themselves, get secure work? Of course no one would design that society. And I think most people reject that society. They just don't think it's practical to change it. But that's why I said draw hope from the neoliberals. They were completely isolated in the 1960s and 1970s. They thought they'd lost. If this was the 1960s and we were just a bunch of neoliberals having this discussion, going, oh, maybe people are innately left-wing, you know, we've been defeated. History is going against us. You know, if they'd had that mentality, they wouldn't have won. But they got organised. You know, I mean, that's the phrase, don't mourn, organise. And that's what we've got to do as well. We've got to learn, you know, the trick is, when you've been defeated, you don't get overly pessimistic. And when you're victorious, you don't get overly complacent. And for me, it's just a question of how do we organise around a coherent set of demands? How do we give people hope? How do we connect our demands to the experiences of ordinary people? How do we learn from the right? How do we have a populism which directs anger away from people's neighbours instead to those at the top who are responsible? That's what we just have to do. For me, it's quite clear that's what we have to do, and we just have to debate the steps about how we get there. But we will get there, because the illusion of every era is that this is permanent. This is the way things will always be. But it is an illusion. Things change. Things have changed dramatically in the last 30 years, and things in another 30 years will dramatically change again.
Bueno, primero darte las gracias por todo lo que has contado aquí. Creo que es de gran utilidad para todos. Y yo te quería preguntar sobre todo sobre el papel de los medios de comunicación a la hora de crear la imagen de la clase obrera, tanto en ficción como en realidad. Y sobre todo, cuál es el poder de la gente, de la clase obrera, de la gente con conciencia de clase, para contrarrestar esa ofensiva de los medios de comunicación que en todos los países del mundo está en manos de la burguesía.
Well, the problem is, in many of our countries, we don't have a free media. We have a media free of government, but that's not the same thing. If you have a media run by a very small number of politically motivated millionaires who aren't just interested in defending the status quo, they are the status quo, where they have a direct stake in the status quo, where in many countries, and I don't know as much in Spain, but in Britain, it's become ever harder for working class people to become journalists because of the rise of unpaid internships, where you have to work for free in order to get a place in the media. Well, how can people who are, not rich do that unless you live off your parents, where you need expensive journalism qualifications? That means people from less privileged backgrounds don't enter the media and then can tell a story themselves of their own experiences and those like them. So for me, the point is this. I mean, we can't just get rid of the corporate media, unfortunately, but we can, and it is going back again to forms like social media, which can democratize media. It goes back to the point made before by the man over there who works with young people, the point about stories are what connect with people more than else. If we were going to win through facts and statistics, we would have won this a very long time ago. And what the government, in our country, what they do, for example, is they hunt down the most extreme and unrepresentative and unsympathetic examples of poor people or immigrants, and they say, this is what they are all like. Okay, I'll give you one example. There was a man on benefits with 14 children or something. He's about as extreme a case as you can get. And he was always on TV and the newspapers because of it. And then he burned down his home in order to blame his ex-wife. But as he burned down the home, 6 of his children died. A terrible and heinous crime, and he went to prison for manslaughter. But what the newspaper, the Daily Mail, the second biggest newspaper in Britain, did the next day was this headline: "Vile product of welfare UK." They said the welfare state was responsible for what this man had done. They dragged in other people who were claiming off the state to make it as though they were associated with this absolute monster. And this is what they always do. And because of it, the media should be challenging people's prejudices. It should be telling the truth about what's going on around them. But in Britain, according to polls, on average, people think fraud of the welfare state, benefit fraud, they think on average it's 27%. It's just 0.7%. People don't realise most people getting benefits are in work. They don't realise that benefits are much lower than they actually think they are. And that is because of the media focusing on extreme examples and telling them lies. So we've got to give a platform to people who are actually affected, using social media, democratising the media in that way, and aggressively using that to give a platform to the sorts of people the man before was talking about. That's the only way we'll win, because when people emotionally connect with them, they can see them for their own eyes, what they're like, and they can counteract the media. One example with the protests. As you know, in this country, you go on a protest, and huge numbers of people take part, and what do the media do? They either ignore it, or they focus on acts of violence or vandalism, and they say that's basically what the protest was. And then the government use that to clamp down on people's liberties and civil liberties. But if you have people there with iPhones in phones taking pictures and showing what's actually going on around them, that helps challenge that. So we've got to be more savvy about using those sorts of instruments to combat the lies and agenda of the mainstream media. We've got a better opportunity to do that than we've ever had, so we should start using it.
Buenas tardes. Me sumo a los agradecimientos que han hecho el resto de los que han hablado. Gracias por venir. Enhorabuena por su libro. Yo quería hacer un par de preguntas. La primera sería si cree que el discurso de izquierdas, el discurso que estamos aquí comentando esta tarde, podría o debería sumar y aglutinar también a la gente, al apoyo que tienen los partidos de centro izquierda, como sería en España el Partido Socialista Obrero Español y en Reino Unido el Partido Laborista, si podrían este discurso convencer tanto a las élites del partido como a las grandísimas capas de apoyo social que tienen, tanto en su país como en el nuestro, y porque probablemente serían necesarios para sumar apoyos y para lograr los objetivos. Y la segunda pregunta sería sobre Escocia, pero no quiero compararla con Cataluña ni nada porque ya estamos cansados de lo mismo. Y lo que quería decirles es que el partido, el SNP, está utilizando un discurso de izquierdas, verde, que intenta asemejar a Escocia y su futuro a Dinamarca o a Noruega, y es realmente un discurso que parece que también está totalmente relacionado con el que estamos hablando esta tarde, y parece eso, que Escocia está dejando, o va a dejarla, o podría dejar la Unión, quiero decir Reino Unido, con un discurso que podría aportar también para Inglaterra y para el resto de su país.
The first point, yes, absolutely. We should build pressure from below on established parties. I mean, in Britain, you know, a new left party, given our electoral system, which doesn't allow new parties, effectively. I mean, UKIP, a hard-right xenophobic party, they're at the moment doing very well in the opinion polls. If they win 20% at the next election, they will not win a single parliamentary seat. That is how hard it is to win seats in Britain. So a new party is so hard that unless the electoral system is proportional representation, it's very difficult. And the trade unions support the Labour, you know, they keep the Labour Party alive. They founded it. And I think in all over Western Europe, there will be people who believe in setting up new parties of the left and people who want to put pressure on the existing parties. But they shouldn't be seen as being in competition. They should be seen as working together. They will divide on strategy, but agree on the issues. And for me, you know, I mean, I support putting as much pressure on the Labour leadership as possible, building pressure from below to change them. And I work with other people who believe that's a stupid strategy and will never work. But fine, you know, we won't agree on that, but I still think there's room for both of those things. So yes, let's build pressure on the existing parties as well, regardless of whether we think we should set up a new party or not. And let's build the broadest possible coalition, because unless we build a broad coalition, we'll fail. We shouldn't ghettoise ourselves. We should reach out, speak, learn from the right, speak in the language of common sense, of everyday bread and butter issues. That's what we should do. The point about Scotland is this. Scotland, you know, it's weird. Scotland used to be a conservative country. In the 1950s, most Scottish people were voting Conservative. Today, the Conservatives are a tiny fringe party in Scotland. And that's because Scotland suffered the worst consequences of neoliberalism, along with other parts of Britain where there was lots of industry. And, you know, I used to live in Scotland, and the Conservatives imposed the poll tax on Scotland first. The poll tax was a local authority tax where everybody paid the same amount of tax, however rich or however poor you were. And it caused a huge mass movement. Millions of people refused to pay it. Hundreds of thousands took to the street. There was a big riot in London, which trashed the place. But that was, because of that, the poll tax was removed and Margaret Thatcher was kicked out of number 10, which was good. But the point is, Scotland, there was this burning resentment because of all of those issues, anger at New Labour as well. And the Scottish National Party, they promoted the sorts of social democratic rhetoric, at least, which New Labour had abandoned, and they won popular support as a result. Now, independence is all mixed up in all of those things. That's why support for independence has got so high. 6 months ago, I'd say Scotland would vote against independence. I'm not so sure anymore, because the British establishment has been so counterproductive. They keep trying to bully Scotland into staying. All the businesses will leave. Your economy will collapse. We won't give you a currency union. You will be kicked out of the European Union, and Spain will veto your ability to get back in the European Union. That's what they're being told at the moment. And the more they've been told this, the more support for independence goes up. And I'm afraid the same has happened with Catalonia. The more the attempt to shut down a referendum, because a constitution, I would suggest, is out of date, and which was written in the aftermath of Franco and the fear of the military and all the rest of it, I think the danger is depriving people of the right to self-determination, to decide whether or not they want to stay in a country or not. That just drives people towards independence. Now, my fear with Scotland, and I support whatever they choose is up to them, the danger is a race to the bottom, because the Scottish National Party have social democratic ideas in some ways, but they want to cut corporation tax on big business. And the danger is then you'd have England and Scotland competing on how much tax they could cut on business. Now, whatever happens, what I support is to strengthen bonds of solidarity, because a supermarket worker in Glasgow has more in common with a supermarket worker in London and a supermarket worker in Madrid than they do with their own bosses. They've all got the same interests. So whatever Scotland decides, and the British establishment are driving them towards independence, whatever Catalonia decide, when inevitably they are given that right to decide, we've got to just keep building those bonds of solidarity. But I don't think independence is a solution. I think often that's what it's seen as, that if we become independent, all of these terrible injustices will disappear. That's not the case. They won't necessarily build a new Norway. They could easily end up building a new neoliberal Ireland, for example, which is now suffering the consequences of those sorts of policies.
Si les parece, por deferencia a las traductoras, que imagino que estarán agotadas, y a los trabajadores del círculo, que también me consta que están cansados, podemos hacer una última intervención, si a alguien le apetece hablar.
Are there any women who've spoken, or has it just been men?
Es cierto. Como Belén, sí.
Bueno, ¿se me oye? Siento
Sí.
no ser mujer, yo también. A ver, yo tenía una pregunta con... Bueno, los tratados de la Unión Europea prohíben que se pongan trabas al... Aquí, que no me ve el muchacho. Prohíben que se pongan trabas al movimiento del capital, lo que acaba derivando en que las empresas producen, bueno, generan ingresos en cualquier parte de la Unión Europea y lo pagan en Irlanda o lo pagan en...
Oh, can you speak a bit slower? Sorry, the translator's got to keep up. Sorry.
Vale, que bueno, que lo que ocurre es que las empresas generan ingresos en cualquier parte de la Unión Europea y los acaban pagando esos ingresos, los impuestos de esos ingresos en paraísos fiscales dentro de la Unión Europea, en la isla de Man, en Gibraltar, en Irlanda, en Holanda, en Luxemburgo,
Sorry,
etc.
is it possible to... The translator's struggling to keep up, so I haven't got that yet. Is it possible to just a bit slower and
Un poco más despacio, por favor.
Okay, I'll try.
Sorry.
A ver, las empresas generan ingresos en cualquier parte de la Unión Europea y los acaban pagando esos ingresos, los impuestos de esos ingresos, en países de la Unión Europea que tienen fiscalidad más baja, en paraísos fiscales, en Luxemburgo, en Irlanda o en dos que son de Reino Unido, en la isla de Man y en Gibraltar, que nos afecta especialmente. Entiendo que usted estará en contra del movimiento de estos capitales libremente o que apoyará que suban los impuestos en esas zonas. Pero mi pregunta no tiene que ver tanto con el movimiento de capitales como con el movimiento de productos. Y la pregunta es obvia. ¿Apoyaría usted que la Unión Europea pasase a un modelo más autárquico, aun a pesar de que eso pudiese crear empleos en la Unión Europea, pero destruirlos en los países que actualmente importan productos? Exportan productos a la Unión Europea, en China.
No. No, I don't support autarky. No, what I'd support is an active industrial strategy, like Germany and other countries have had to some degree, where you create jobs which are very difficult to export because you train up a labour force, you skill up rather than... What we've had often in Western countries is de-skilling, where you strip skills from the workforce. They call it the hourglass economy, like an hourglass. Middle-class professional jobs at the top, low-paid, insecure, skilled jobs at the bottom, and then a missing middle of secure, skilled, middle-income jobs. So instead of imposing, tariffs or whatever, or autarky, what I'm saying is you need an industrial strategy to create new industries like renewable energy, back up with research, with high-tech research and development, which is difficult to just export. That's why Germany, unlike Britain, have kept their manufacturing base. They have a strong manufacturing base, while in Britain it was trashed because they didn't have that industrial strategy. So that's the way we keep modernizing industry and changing it and adapting it, but that needs the state to intervene, but that doesn't need autarky.
Muy bien, pues si les parece lo dejamos aquí. Quería darles las gracias a todos por la asistencia y por sus preguntas, que realmente a mí al menos me han resultado extremadamente sugerentes. Y bueno, pues muchas gracias también al Círculo de Bellas Artes y a las traductoras que han hecho un trabajo esforzado y difícil, y por supuesto a Owen Jones. Gracias.